I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the trash can where my seat should have been. It was my son Daniel's wedding day, the kind of bright spring afternoon people wait years for. The sky clear over the white chapel outside Denver, and the mountains faint in the distance like something painted onto the horizon. The reception hall had been decorated with pale roses and long wooden tables covered in linen runners, and soft music drifted through the open windows while guests laughed and clinked glasses of sparkling cider. I had arrived early, the way mothers do, wearing the navy blue dress I had carefully chosen 2 weeks before and the pearl necklace my late husband gave me on our 30th anniversary. I remember thinking Daniel would notice it. He always used to notice small things like that. At least he did before he married Olivia. A large seating chart stood near the entrance to the reception hall, printed in elegant calligraphy on a framed board. Guests were gathering around it, pointing and smiling while they found their names. I stepped forward slowly, scanning the list until I reached the Whitmore family table. Daniel Whitmore, Olivia Whitmore, friends from Daniel's office, Olivia's parents. Then I found my name, Margaret Whitmore, except there was something strange beside it. Instead of a table number or chair placement, someone had written a small word next to it in a playful script. Trash. I thought it must be a mistake at first. My eyes drifted to the table indicated on the chart. Everyone else had a place card arranged neatly beside crystal glasses and folded napkins. But where my chair should have been, there was a small stainless steel trash can sitting beside the table leg like it belonged there. It wasn't hidden or subtle. It was right in the open. A few guests had already noticed it. Some looked confused. Others looked away quickly, pretending not to see anything. I felt the room grow quieter around me, even though the music hadn't stopped. For a moment, I simply stood there holding my purse, staring at that little metal can reflecting the soft light from the windows. Then I heard Olivia's voice behind me, light and amused. Margaret, you found your seat. I turned slowly. Olivia was standing with 2 bridesmaids, her champagne-colored dress catching the sunlight. She tilted her head, slightly as if she were studying my reaction like someone watching a small experiment. I glanced back toward the trash can and then at her again. I'm not sure I understand, I said quietly. One of the bridesmaids covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Olivia rolled her eyes in an exaggerated way and waved a hand. Oh, relax, Margaret. It's just a joke. Don't be so dramatic. The words hung in the air as casually as if she had commented on the weather. Around us, a few guests shifted uncomfortably, pretending to adjust their jackets or check their phones. Someone near the bar cleared his throat. The band continued playing a slow instrumental piece that suddenly sounded too loud in my ears. I looked back at the table again. The trash can was still there. Polished steel. Empty. Waiting. For a moment, I thought about Daniel. I wondered if he knew about this. My son, who used to run across the yard when he was 8 years old with scraped knees and dirt on his hands, calling for me like I could fix anything. My son who once promised when he was a teenager that he would always take care of me the way I took care of him. I searched the room for him now, but he was across the hall talking with a group of friends, smiling widely, completely unaware or perhaps choosing not to notice. Olivia leaned closer and lowered her voice slightly. Come on, Margaret. It's a wedding. People are supposed to laugh. I studied her face for a moment. Then I nodded once. If it's a joke, I said softly, then I suppose the polite thing is to laugh. Olivia smiled as if she had won something. I walked toward the table, moved the small trash can gently aside, and took the empty chair beside it without saying another word. The music continued playing as if nothing unusual had happened. Soft piano drifting through the reception hall while waiters carried trays of sparkling water and appetizers between the tables. Conversations slowly resumed around me, but I could feel the subtle shift in the room, the way people were suddenly careful about where they looked. A few guests glanced toward the small trash can beside my chair and then quickly focused on their plates or their phones. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the light coming through the tall windows along the wall. Outside, the afternoon sun painted long shadows across the garden where the ceremony had taken place only an hour earlier. It had been beautiful. I could not deny that. Olivia walked down the aisle in a dress that shimmered softly in the sunlight, and Daniel had looked proud and nervous in his gray suit. For a moment during the ceremony, when they exchanged vows, I even felt something close to peace. I told myself that this was what every parent hopes for. You raise a child, you teach him to walk, to ride a bicycle, to drive a car, and eventually you stand quietly while he begins a life of his own. But sitting there now, with the cold metal trash reflecting the light beside my chair, I realized how far that quiet place had moved from where I was sitting. A waiter approached and gently set a glass of iced tea in front of me. The ice cubes clinked softly against the glass. "Thank you," I said politely, and he nodded with a kind expression before moving away. Across the table, Olivia's parents were speaking with a couple I did not recognize. They laughed easily, as if everything around them was perfectly normal. I wondered if they knew about the joke. Perhaps they did. Perhaps they had even helped plan it. The thought surprised me less than it should have. I picked up the glass of iced tea and took a small sip. The sweetness was strong, almost too strong, but I did not mind. When you reach 72 years of age, you learn that some moments cannot be fixed with a conversation. Some moments simply reveal something that has been quietly forming for a long time. My eyes drifted across the room until I found Daniel again. He was standing near the dance floor with several of his college friends, smiling the way he used to when he came home during winter break. I studied his face carefully, searching for the boy I remembered. When he was 10 years old, he used to sit at the kitchen table while I made pancakes on Saturday mornings. He would talk endlessly about baseball or school projects or the strange ideas children invent when they feel safe enough to speak freely. Back then, he always asked my opinion about everything. Now he had not even looked in my direction since the reception began. I wondered if he had noticed the trash can at all, or perhaps he had noticed and decided that saying nothing was easier. That possibility settled quietly in my chest, not like anger, but like a small piece of truth finding its proper place. A woman at the next table leaned toward her husband and whispered something while glancing at me. He shook his head slightly, as if embarrassed for reasons he could not explain. I offered them a polite smile, the kind people exchange with strangers in grocery store aisles or airport lounges. They both looked relieved and returned the smile quickly. Olivia passed by our table a few minutes later, greeting guests with practiced warmth. She paused when she reached me and rested one hand lightly on the back of Daniel's empty chair. "Margaret, are you enjoying the reception?" she asked in a bright voice. I looked up at her. "Yes," I said calmly. "Everything looks lovely." She glanced down at the trash can beside my seat and then back at my face, studying me again the way someone studies a puzzle. "I suppose you understand that people have different senses of humor," she said lightly. I nodded once. "That is true," I replied. "And sometimes humor tells us more than people realize." For a brief moment her smile tightened, just slightly, before she turned away and continued greeting the other guests. I watched her walk across the room, confident and graceful, shaking hands and laughing with friends as if the entire afternoon belonged to her. Perhaps she believed it did. I placed my glass back on the table and folded my hands together again. Somewhere behind me, the band began another song, a slow instrumental piece meant for the first dances later in the evening. I sat quietly, listening to the music and watching the sunlight move slowly across the floor, and I realized something that surprised even me. The trash can beside my chair was not the most important thing in the room. What mattered more was the quiet understanding forming in my mind, the kind that arrives not with anger or tears, but with clarity. Because sometimes the smallest joke reveals exactly where you stand in someone else's life. And once you see it clearly, you cannot pretend that you did not. I remained seated at the table long after the first wave of laughter and music filled the reception hall again. And little by little the event continued, as if the strange moment earlier had simply dissolved into the background of the afternoon. Plates were set down, silverware clinked softly, and waiters moved between tables carrying trays of roasted chicken, seasonal vegetables, and warm bread. The smell of fresh herbs drifted through the room, blending with the faint scent of roses from the centerpieces. I watched everything quietly, noticing details the way people often do when they realize they are no longer part of the celebration itself, but instead an observer sitting slightly outside of it. Daniel eventually walked across the room with a few of his friends, laughing about something that had happened during the ceremony. His shoulders looked relaxed, the way they used to when he returned home from college during the holidays. For a moment, I wondered if he would come over to speak with me, but he stopped several feet away to greet Olivia's parents instead. I listened to their voices blend together in casual conversation while I slowly unfolded the napkin on my lap. When Daniel finally glanced in my direction, his eyes paused on the table for a second, then shifted away as though something about the scene made him uncomfortable. He lifted his glass, nodded briefly toward me, and turned back to his friends without walking over. That small gesture told me more than a long explanation ever could. Some choices are not made with words. Sometimes silence becomes the decision. A few minutes later, the wedding planner stepped to the front of the room and tapped a glass lightly with a spoon. The clear, ringing sound cut through the conversations, and the music faded gently as everyone turned toward the small stage near the dance floor. It was time for the first speeches. I folded my hands again and watched as Olivia's father stood to give the first toast. He spoke warmly about family traditions and about how proud he was to welcome Daniel into their family. People laughed at the appropriate moments and lifted their glasses when he finished. Then the best man followed, sharing stories about Daniel from their college years that made the younger guests grin and shake their heads. The entire room seemed full of easy warmth, the kind that weddings are meant to create. Finally, Olivia took the microphone for a short speech of her own. She stood gracefully beside Daniel, one hand resting lightly on his arm. Her voice carried clearly through the room as she thanked friends, family members, and everyone who had helped organize the event. She spoke about love, about new beginnings, and about how important support from family had been during the planning process. At one point, her eyes moved across the tables and paused briefly in my direction. For a fraction of a second, I thought she might mention me or acknowledge the years Daniel and I had spent building the life that had brought him to this moment. Instead, she smiled politely and continued speaking about the future she and Daniel were about to begin together. When the applause filled the room again, I joined in with the others, clapping slowly and evenly. The music started once more and guests began moving toward the dance floor while the sun outside dropped lower behind the trees. Through the tall windows, the light had shifted into a softer golden color that stretched across the polished floor like a quiet reminder that the afternoon was moving forward whether anyone noticed or not. I looked down at the small metal trash can beside my chair again, its surface now glowing faintly in the warm light. It no longer felt like an insult. Instead, it felt like evidence, a small and very clear symbol placed exactly where it needed to be so that I could see something that had been forming for a long time. I thought about the past few years, about the gradual changes that had appeared after Olivia entered Daniel's life. Small things at first, shorter phone calls, fewer visits during the holidays, conversations that seemed to end quickly whenever certain topics came up. At the time, I told myself it was simply the natural rhythm of a son building his own life. But sitting there now, listening to the music and the laughter while the evening celebration slowly unfolded, I understood that the distance had not appeared all at once. It had grown quietly, piece by piece, until a moment like today could happen without anyone stopping it. Across the room, Daniel and Olivia stepped onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. Guests gathered around them in a wide circle while the band began playing a slow melody. The lights dimmed slightly and the soft glow of candles filled the room. Everyone watched them with warm expressions as they moved together in the center of the floor. I watched as well, but not with the same expectations I once carried. Instead, I observed the scene the way someone might watch a chapter of a story closing. Because sometimes a person does not truly understand where they stand in someone else's life until a very small moment makes it impossible to ignore, and once that understanding arrives, the world around you begins to look very different even while everything else continues exactly the same. The music on the dance floor continued for several minutes while guests gathered closer around Daniel and Olivia, smiling and recording the moment on their phones. I remained seated at the table, watching quietly as the newly married couple turned slowly beneath the warm lights. Their first dance looked graceful from a distance, the kind of moment photographers love to capture. I noticed how carefully Olivia held Daniel's attention, how she spoke softly to him while they moved, occasionally glancing around the room as if measuring the reactions of everyone watching. When the song ended, applause filled the hall and guests began returning to their tables again. The band started another upbeat tune, and several younger guests hurried toward the dance floor. A few minutes later, Daniel finally approached the table where I was sitting. He walked slowly, adjusting the sleeve of his suit jacket as though preparing for a conversation he was not entirely comfortable having. When he reached me, he stopped beside the empty chair across the table and looked down briefly at the small metal trash can that had been moved slightly aside earlier. His expression shifted for a moment, something between embarrassment and hesitation. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice lower than the noise of the room around us. I looked up at him calmly. "Hello, Daniel," I replied. "You look very happy today." He rubbed the back of his neck in a familiar gesture that reminded me of when he used to struggle with homework problems as a teenager. "Yes, it is a great day," he said, glancing briefly toward the dance floor where Olivia was now laughing with her bridesmaids. "I want to talk to you about earlier." I waited without speaking, giving him the space to continue. He cleared his throat and shifted his weight slightly. Olivia can have a playful sense of humor sometimes. She did not mean anything serious by that seat thing. It was just meant to lighten the mood. Several guests nearby were talking loudly about the dessert table, but his words were still clear enough for me to hear every detail. I folded my hands together on the table and looked at him steadily. "I understand that people often call something a joke when they do not want to explain it," I said gently. Daniel sighed and leaned one hand on the back of the chair across from me. "Mom, you know how weddings are. Everyone is under stress." There were a lot of last-minute changes with the seating chart and decorations. Olivia probably thought it would be funny. He paused, searching my face as if expecting anger or disappointment. Instead, I simply nodded once. "Planning events can certainly be complicated," I said. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The band played a lively tune while guests clapped along with the rhythm. Daniel glanced again at the small trash can beside my chair and quickly moved it farther under the table with his foot, as if hiding it might erase the memory of how it arrived there. "Look," he said quietly, "I just do not want any awkward tension today. This is supposed to be a happy day for everyone." I studied his expression carefully. There was something different in the way he spoke now compared to the boy I raised. Not cruel, not intentionally dismissive, but distant in a way that suggested his priorities had shifted somewhere beyond my reach. "Happiness often depends on where a person chooses to stand," I replied calmly. "Today you have chosen to stand beside your wife. That is exactly where a husband belongs." Daniel exhaled slowly, perhaps relieved that I had not argued with him. "I knew you would understand," he said quickly. "You have always been reasonable about things." He straightened his jacket again and glanced back toward the dance floor, where Olivia was now looking in our direction. "I should get back to the guests," he added. "There are still a lot of people I need to talk to before dinner finishes." "Of course," I said softly. "Enjoy your evening, Daniel." He gave a brief nod and walked away, moving quickly across the room toward Olivia. She met him halfway between the tables and spoke to him with a curious smile, while her eyes flicked briefly toward me. Daniel said something quietly, and she laughed lightly, touching his arm before guiding him back toward their friends. I remained seated where I was, watching the interaction from across the room. The music continued, the guests continued laughing, and waiters began serving slices of wedding cake on delicate white plates. Everything around me looked exactly the way a wedding reception should look. Yet the short conversation with Daniel had confirmed something I already suspected. The trash can beside my chair had not been placed there by accident or confusion. It had been placed there because no one expected me to object strongly enough to matter, and because the people who once would have defended me had slowly stepped into different roles in their lives. I lifted my glass of iced tea again and took a quiet sip while the celebration carried on around me, aware that the understanding forming in my mind was becoming clearer with every passing minute. The reception continued with the comfortable rhythm of celebration while the band shifted into another lively song and more guests joined the dance floor, laughing and spinning beneath the warm yellow lights. Plates of cake and coffee began appearing on the tables, and the servers moved through the room with quiet efficiency. I remained seated where I was, watching the evening unfold with the calm attention that comes when a person realizes they are no longer trying to control the moment. From my chair, I could see nearly the entire hall. The floral arrangements along the walls, the candles flickering on each table, the wide windows now reflecting the darker blue of the evening sky outside. The reception had moved past sunset, and the room felt warmer now, filled with conversation and music. A young woman approached my table carefully, holding her phone in one hand and a small plate of cake in the other. She looked to be in her early 20s, wearing a soft green dress and a nervous smile. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Mrs. Whitmore." I recognized her after a moment as Emily, Daniel's cousin from his father's side of the family. I had not seen her in several years, not since she graduated from high school. "Hello, Emily," I said gently. "It is nice to see you again." She placed the plate of cake in front of me and sat down in the chair beside mine instead of across the table, lowering her voice slightly as she spoke. "I just wanted to check on you," she said. "Earlier, when everyone was looking at the seating chart, I saw what happened. I did not think it was funny." I appreciated the sincerity in her voice. "Thank you, Emily," I replied quietly. Sometimes people laugh at things simply because they do not know what else to do. Emily glanced down at the small metal trash can beside the table and shook her head slightly. "Olivia told the wedding planner to put it there," she said carefully. "I overheard her earlier when they were finishing the decorations. She said it would make the guests laugh and that you would probably stay quiet about it anyway." Her words were not spoken with anger, only a kind of honest concern. I looked at her for a moment, studying the nervous way she twisted the edge of her napkin in her fingers. "That must have been uncomfortable for you to hear," I said gently. Emily nodded once. "I almost said something at the time," she admitted, but the room was full of people and Olivia seemed very certain about what she wanted. She paused before adding softly, "I just wanted you to know it was not an accident." I appreciated her honesty more than she realized. Sometimes clarity arrives through small conversations like this, quiet confirmations that remove any remaining doubt. I reached for the fork beside my plate and cut a small piece of cake. The frosting was light and sweet, the kind often chosen for large celebrations because everyone can enjoy it without thinking too much about the flavor. "Thank you for telling me, Emily," I said calmly. She looked relieved that I had not reacted with anger or sadness. "I think people underestimate you sometimes," she said after a moment. I smiled faintly at that. "Many people do," I replied. Across the room, Daniel and Olivia were greeting another group of guests near the entrance, shaking hands and posing for photographs. Olivia looked radiant in the soft light, her laughter rising above the music whenever someone congratulated her. Daniel remained beside her, smiling politely while adjusting his tie from time to time. They looked every bit like the happy couple everyone had come to celebrate. Emily followed my gaze for a moment before speaking again. "Do you think Daniel knows what Olivia said earlier?" she asked quietly. I considered the question before answering. "I believe Daniel knows exactly what he needs to know," I said slowly. "Whether he chooses to notice the rest is something only he can decide." Emily seemed to think about that for a moment before nodding. "Well, I'm glad you came today," she said sincerely. "Even if some people forgot what respect looks like." I set my fork down and folded my hand again. "Respect has a way of revealing itself over time," I said. "Sometimes it appears when you least expect it." Emily offered a small smile before standing and returning to join her friends on the dance floor. I watched her walk away, grateful for the quiet kindness she had shown in a room filled with louder voices. The band began another song, and guests continued celebrating while the evening moved forward. Yet Emily's words had confirmed something important, something that made the events of the day feel less confusing and more deliberate. The placement of that small trash can beside my chair had not been a careless decoration or an unfortunate misunderstanding. It had been a choice, and choices, once made in front of an entire room full of witnesses, have a way of echoing much longer than the laughter they are meant to create. The evening continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of celebration. music drifting through the reception hall while guests moved easily between the dance floor and their tables. The band had switched to a slower song now, and couples swayed beneath the warm glow of the lights while servers refilled glasses and cleared away empty plates. From where I sat, I could see nearly every corner of the room, and the longer I watched, the more I realized how carefully everything had been arranged. The decorations, the lighting, the order of the speeches, even the timing of the music had been planned down to the smallest detail. Nothing in this room had happened by accident, and that understanding settled quietly in my mind like a piece of a puzzle finally sliding into place. I lifted my glass of water and took a slow sip while my eyes moved across the room again. Daniel and Olivia were standing near the cake table now, speaking with a group of Daniel's coworkers. Olivia laughed brightly as one of them told a story about a business trip they had taken together the previous year. Daniel stood beside her, nodding politely and occasionally adjusting the sleeve of his jacket the way he often did when he was thinking about something else. From a distance, they looked perfectly happy, the kind of newly married couple people expect to see at a wedding reception. Yet the longer I watched them, the more I noticed the small things that others might overlook. Olivia spoke confidently, guiding the conversation with easy charm, while Daniel followed her lead without interruption. When she turned slightly toward the guests, he turned as well. When she laughed, he smiled. It was a subtle rhythm, but once he noticed it, you could not ignore it. My attention drifted back to the small metal trash can beside my chair, now pushed partly beneath the table where Daniel had moved it earlier. Its polished surface reflected the soft lights above us, almost glowing against the darker carpet beneath the table. I studied it for a moment before gently sliding it farther away with the tip of my shoe so that it rested completely under the table. The action was quiet and unremarkable, yet it carried a certain finality that only I seemed to notice. Moments later, a familiar voice spoke beside me. "Mrs. Whitmore, it is good to see you again." I turned slightly and recognized Thomas Reed standing beside the table. He was a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and a calm expression, someone I had known for many years. Thomas had been my husband's attorney long before Daniel was old enough to drive a car, and he had attended many family events over the decades. "Thomas," I said warmly, rising slightly from my chair to greet him. "I did not realize you were here tonight." He offered a polite smile and glanced briefly toward the dance floor where the celebration continued. "Daniel invited me several weeks ago," he explained. "Your husband always believed family milestones deserved proper witnesses." I nodded at the mention of my late husband, feeling the familiar mixture of memory and gratitude that accompanied his name. Thomas took the empty chair beside me and lowered his voice slightly so our conversation would remain private amid the music and laughter surrounding us. "I had hoped to speak with you for a moment this evening," he said calmly. "There are a few matters related to your husband's estate that we should review soon. Nothing urgent, but certain documents are scheduled to be finalized within the next few weeks." I listened carefully, aware that Thomas never spoke casually about legal matters. My husband had trusted him for decades, and that trust had always been well placed. "I see," I replied quietly. "Perhaps we can schedule a meeting after everyone returns home from the honeymoon." "That would be wise," Thomas agreed. He paused briefly before adding in a thoughtful tone, "Your husband was very precise about the way he organized certain arrangements. He believed strongly that respect within a family was not simply emotional, but also practical. The wording of his trust reflects that philosophy quite clearly." His words were calm and professional, yet something in the way he spoke made me look at him more closely. I understood enough about legal language to recognize when a statement carried deeper meaning than it appeared on the surface. "My husband always valued clarity," I said softly. Thomas inclined his head in agreement. "Yes, he did. And clarity has a way of revealing itself at the right moment." For a moment, we both looked across the room where Daniel and Olivia were now cutting the wedding cake while guests gathered around with their phones raised to capture the scene. The crowd laughed and applauded as the newly married couple shared the first slice together. Thomas followed my gaze and then returned his attention to me with the same calm expression he had always carried in difficult conversations. "Whenever you are ready, Mrs. Whitmore, We will review everything together, he said quietly. Some decisions take years to prepare, but they are always meant to protect the people who deserve that protection most. I nodded slowly, understanding far more from that sentence than the words themselves seemed to reveal. Around us, the celebration continued with joyful noise and bright smiles, but a quieter understanding had begun forming beneath the surface of the evening. And for the first time since I walked into the reception hall earlier that afternoon, I felt something unexpected, settling into place within my thoughts. Not anger or sadness, but a quiet sense that the story unfolding around me had not yet reached its final chapter. The celebration continued late into the evening as the reception hall grew warmer and louder with music, conversation, and the steady movement of guests enjoying the final hours of the wedding. The band played a lively song that brought several couples back onto the dance floor, and the soft golden lights above the room reflected off the polished wood floor where people laughed and spun in wide circles. I remained seated at my table for a while longer, watching the rhythm of the evening unfold. The small metal trash can was still tucked quietly beneath the table where Daniel had pushed it earlier, hidden from most people, but not forgotten by me. Across the room, Daniel and Olivia were moving from group to group, greeting guests and thanking them for coming. Every few minutes, someone would pull them aside for photographs, and flashes of light briefly filled the air while the photographer guided them into another smiling pose. From a distance, they looked exactly like the couple everyone expected to see on their wedding night, confident and full of excitement for the future. After some time, the band slowed the music again, and the wedding planner stepped to the microphone near the stage. Her voice carried across the room with practiced ease as she announced that the final dances of the evening would begin soon. Guests were invited to gather their belongings, enjoy one last round of desserts and coffee, and prepare for the send-off outside the hall. The soft murmur of conversation shifted as people began collecting coats and small gift bags from the chairs. I stood slowly from the table and smoothed the fabric of my dress, feeling the quiet stiffness in my legs that often arrives after sitting too long. As I reached for my purse, Thomas Reed approached once more, his calm expression unchanged from earlier. "Are you heading out soon, Margaret?" he asked gently. "I believe it is about that time," I replied. "It has been a long day." Thomas nodded thoughtfully and glanced briefly toward the dance floor, where Daniel and Olivia were finishing another dance together, while guests applauded. "Before you leave," he said quietly, "I would like to remind you that we still need to meet next week. There are several documents connected to your husband's estate that require your signature and review." "I remember," I said. "Tuesday afternoon would be convenient." "That will work perfectly," he replied. "There are some details that Daniel will eventually need to understand as well, but the timing of that conversation will depend on you." I studied his face for a moment, recognizing again that careful way he spoke when something important rested beneath his words. "Thank you for your discretion, Thomas," I said calmly. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried years of professional respect between us. "Your husband trusted your judgment above all else," he said. "I have no reason to doubt it now." Across the room, Daniel noticed us speaking and walked over quickly, adjusting his tie again as he approached. "Mom," he said with a polite smile, "are you leaving already?" I looked at him and returned the smile with quiet calm. "Yes, Daniel, I believe it is time for me to head home. You both have a busy morning ahead with your flight." He nodded and glanced briefly at Thomas, recognizing him from earlier conversations. "Mr. Reed, it is good to see you again," Daniel said. Thomas offered a professional handshake. "Congratulations on your marriage, Daniel. I'm sure the evening has been memorable." Daniel smiled at that and then turned back to me. "Thank you for coming today, Mom," he said. "I know things might have felt a little awkward earlier." I held his gaze for a moment, seeing both the familiar features of the child I raised and the distant expression of the man he had become. "Every family gathering has its moments," I replied gently. "The important thing is that you have begun the life you chose." He seemed satisfied with that answer and nodded. Olivia walked over then, her expression bright and confident as always. "Margaret, I hope you enjoyed the reception," she said lightly. "Everything looked very beautiful," I replied. She glanced quickly at Daniel and then back at me, perhaps wondering if I would mention the small incident that had begun the evening. When I did not, she simply smiled again and slipped her arm through Daniel's. "We should go greet the guests outside before the send-off begins," she said to him. Daniel nodded and looked at me once more. "Good night, Mom. Drive safely." "Good night, Daniel," I answered. I picked up my purse and walked slowly toward the exit of the hall while the celebration continued behind me. Guests were gathering near the doors, holding small sparklers that would soon light the walkway outside for the newly married couple. The music, the laughter, and the bright lights of the reception faded gradually as I stepped into the cooler evening air beyond the doorway. For a moment, I paused on the steps outside the hall and looked back through the open doors where the celebration still glowed warmly inside. The evening had revealed far more than a simple wedding celebration, and the quiet conversation with Thomas had confirmed that the future held conversations Daniel did not yet expect. I turned toward the parking lot where the rows of cars waited beneath the streetlights and walked forward calmly, aware that the night had closed one chapter of my life while preparing the ground for another that had not yet begun. The drive home that night felt unusually quiet, even though the highway was not empty. The headlights of passing cars slid across the windshield in long white lines, and the steady hum of the engine filled the silence inside my vehicle. I kept both hands lightly on the steering wheel and followed the familiar road toward the neighborhood where I had lived for nearly 3 decades. Weddings often leave people feeling emotional or nostalgic, but the feeling inside me was not sadness or regret. It was something calmer than that, something closer to clarity. When you reach a certain age, you learn that clarity can be more valuable than comfort. I reached my driveway a little after 10:30 and parked the car beneath the old maple tree that my husband planted the year Daniel started elementary school. The house stood quiet and still under the porch light. For a moment, I remained seated in the car, looking at the familiar shape of the front windows and the small garden beside the steps. Every corner of this house held memories of a life that had unfolded slowly and patiently over many years. Daniel had learned to ride his bicycle in the driveway. He had studied for college exams at the kitchen table while I brewed coffee late at night. And when my husband passed away 7 years earlier, it was in the living room, where we had spent so many quiet evenings together. I stepped out of the car and walked inside, setting my purse on the entry table before turning on the soft lamp near the couch. The house greeted me with the quiet comfort of a place that has witnessed every version of your life without judgment. I removed my shoes and sat down in the living room chair for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. The events of the evening replayed in my mind with surprising clarity. Olivia's smile near the seating chart, Daniel's awkward explanation beside the table, Emily's quiet honesty about what she had overheard, and Thomas Reed's calm reminder that certain decisions had been prepared long before this wedding day arrived. I stood again after a moment and walked into the kitchen where the small calendar hung beside the refrigerator. Tuesday afternoon, I thought. That would be the meeting Thomas mentioned. I filled a glass with water from the sink and leaned lightly against the counter while considering the conversation that would soon take place. My husband had always believed that responsibility was not only about building a future, but also about protecting it. The trust he created years earlier had been his way of ensuring that the values we shared would remain intact long after he was gone. At the time, I understood the documents only in general terms. Tonight, however, Thomas's words had made it clear that those arrangements carried more weight than I once realized. I finished the glass of water and placed it beside the sink before returning to the living room. On the bookshelf near the window stood a framed photograph taken many years earlier. Daniel was 8 years old in that picture, standing between his father and me in front of the same maple tree outside. He held a baseball glove in one hand and wore the proud smile of a boy who believed his parents could solve any problem. I picked up the frame and studied the photograph carefully. Time changes people in ways that photographs cannot predict. The boy in that picture had grown into a man who now lived a life shaped by new priorities and new loyalties. That was not entirely unusual. Every parent eventually learns that children build their own paths forward. Yet respect is something different from independence. Respect is a choice that reveals. itself in moments when no one believes they will be questioned. I placed the photograph back on the shelf and turned off the living room lamp before heading toward the hallway. Tomorrow, the newly married couple would board a flight to begin their honeymoon in another state. The celebration would continue in photographs and social media posts while guests returned to their daily routines. But the quiet conversation waiting on Tuesday afternoon would begin a different chapter altogether. I switched off the final light near the kitchen and paused briefly in the darkness of the hallway. Somewhere outside, the wind moved softly through the leaves of the maple tree, a gentle rustling sound that had accompanied countless nights in this house. I walked slowly toward the bedroom and closed the door behind me, aware that the calm I felt now was not the calm of someone defeated, but the calm of someone who finally understands exactly where the path ahead will lead. Tuesday afternoon arrived with clear skies and the quiet rhythm of an ordinary weekday, the kind of calm day that gives a person time to think clearly about what truly matters. I drove to Thomas Reed's office just before 2 o'clock, parking beside the small brick building where his firm had worked for decades. The sign outside still carried the same name it had when my husband first introduced me to Thomas nearly 20 years earlier. I walked inside and was greeted by the familiar scent of polished wood and paper files, a quiet professional atmosphere that felt steady and predictable in a world that had changed so quickly over the past few days. Thomas's assistant welcomed me warmly and guided me to the conference room where Thomas was already waiting with several folders neatly arranged on the table. "Good afternoon, Margaret," he said as I entered. "Thank you for coming in today." I took the chair across from him and placed my purse beside me. "Thank you for seeing me, Thomas," I replied. "You mentioned that there were documents we needed to review." He nodded calmly and opened one of the folders in front of him. "Your husband believed strongly in preparing for the future," he began. "Several years before his passing, he created a trust that organized the family assets in a very specific way. At the time, you both agreed that the details should remain private until the appropriate moment arrived." I listened carefully as he placed several pages on the table and turned them toward me. The trust contained the house I currently lived in, several investment accounts, and a substantial share of the company my husband and I had built together over the years. Those assets had been carefully protected so they could support both my future and Daniel's when the time was right. However, there was an important condition written clearly into the agreement. Your husband believed that financial support should reflect not only family connection, but also mutual respect, Thomas explained. The trust states that Daniel will receive full control of the remaining assets only if he maintains a respectful relationship with you and demonstrates that commitment publicly as well as privately. I studied the document slowly, recognizing my husband's careful handwriting in the margins where he had once reviewed the final drafts. "And if that condition is not met," I asked quietly. Thomas folded his hands and spoke in the calm tone of someone who had handled many serious conversations before. "If Daniel's actions clearly demonstrate disregard for that responsibility, the trust instructs that control of the assets remains entirely with you. After your lifetime, the remaining funds would then transfer to a charitable foundation supporting educational scholarships, something your husband cared about deeply." I leaned back slightly in the chair, thinking about the events that had unfolded only 3 days earlier. The reception hall, the seating chart, the small metal trash can place beside my chair in front of dozens of guests. In that moment, I realized that my husband had anticipated the possibility of exactly this kind of situation long before it ever happened. Thomas watched my expression carefully before continuing. "I attended the wedding because Daniel invited me," he said. "I also attended because your husband believed that certain moments reveal a person's true priorities. The events of that evening provided a very clear example of how those priorities are currently arranged." I looked at him and nodded slowly. "Then the trust remains exactly as it is," I said. "For now, yes," Thomas replied. "But eventually Daniel will expect to learn how the estate is structured. That conversation will likely occur once he returns from his honeymoon." I thought about Daniel and Olivia boarding their flight that morning, excited about the future they were building together. They believed their life ahead would unfold exactly as they expected. Sometimes the future is more complicated than people imagine, I said quietly. Thomas offered a small, understanding smile. Your husband once told me that respect is not proven by words during comfortable moments. He said, it is proven by behavior when someone believes there will be no consequences. I signed the documents we reviewed and closed the folder gently before sliding it back across the table. Thank you for explaining everything clearly, Thomas, I said. He stood and walked with me toward the office door. Your husband trusted you to make thoughtful decisions. Margaret, he said as we reached the hallway. I believe that trust was well placed. I stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunlight and paused for a moment beside my car. The events of the wedding now felt less like a painful memory and more like a turning point that had revealed something important. Respect cannot be demanded, and it cannot be forced. It can only be recognized when it is present or clearly seen when it is missing. I opened the car door and sat behind the wheel, aware that Daniel would soon learn that every choice carries consequences, even the quiet choices made during a celebration when someone believes no one will remember what happened.